Actually, we've gotten very far so far this summer in these classes. We have exactly about 6 more classes to finish up. And we'll talk a lot more about what those classes are. And we'll send out a whole schedule and make it a little bit easier for folks today. I know there's a lot of people that are out today because they're either out of the country or out of town. But, you know, they are going to watch this video. Now, the thing is, crazily enough, we didn't schedule a big lecture on this issue on the state. Instead, it was an interactive thing. So the people that have gathered here are going to have to do a lot of talking for this class. Just have to assure you that. The first hour of the class, we're going to talk about the state, what Karl Marx meant by the state, what Lenin means by the state and state revolution. And I don't know how many people got a chance to read the first chapter of the book, State and Revolution. If you didn't, there is also an audio link that you can get from YouTube for people who, you know, while you're walking, you're exercising, you're doing whatever, you can also be listening to the book. So it's very, very nice. It's easy, about 30 minutes of the videotape that you can actually hear the book. But the second part of the class, we are going to have a small presentation. Stephen's going to talk about sort of the party's record, particularly right here in Baltimore, in fighting state violence, talking about police state violence. So there's actually a long history that a lot of people don't know because it goes back over a decade or so ago. Decades, actually, and Stephen's going to tell us a little bit about that for 10 minutes. If we get to it, the last part of the reading was on, Sam's book, wrote a very short pamphlet called The Klan Yesterday and Today. And the reason why I put it in the class was that it really explains the connection between the Klan and fascist groups with the state apparatus itself. It was written in 1983, so it's amazing how clear and how much it's current for today's period in fighting fascism. So we may not get to it, but the reading's there, and I don't know, Anna probably won't mind, this isn't a big public tape, but we're talking about maybe getting some of these books into audiobooks ourselves for people who like to do audio stuff. So I put this little thing up on the board and have a couple questions that I thought as a group we could answer. So my general style of craziness, we got it up here. The big question, what is the state? That's the first question. Like, what is Marx and Engels? What does Lenin mean when they say state? But I'll start with Stephen because he's probably give us some examples. Are you ready, Stephen? And then we'll just go around the table. People can tell us what you think, you know, what they meant. There's no wrong answers in any of this. So we'll go through it and then we'll summarize it. But it's an important concept because they say, what is the state? And we learn one thing in high school, but what is the Marxist revolutionary view of the state? So Stephen, I talked a little bit so you can get your thoughts. Just one example.
One example, well, the police are definitely part of the state.
IRS.
Anna?
Government.
The government, yeah. Ah, I spelled that wrong. Somebody ding me on that. Rasika?
That's a border.
Pardon?
Border.
What?
It's a state have a border,
Oh,
right?
the state itself, the border, you know, nation states.
Yeah.
Stephen, you got another example?
The courts.
Courts.
Prisons.
Prisons.
Prisons, okay.
Yeah.
Anna, you want to throw another one out if you can think of anything?
Military.
Military?
Yeah.
Rasika, another thought?
Schools.
Yep.
Public education.
Yeah, schools.
Schools are kind of.
I don't know how you would say confinement to your class.
Oh.
Can't think of a word for
Okay, so let me get to what they say, literally what Mark said, is special bodies of armed men and prisons, they give as an example. But really, it's when they say state apparatus, they're really talking about, excuse me, all of the things in society that one class uses to oppress another class. So you all are right in some way, shape, or form. I mean, the big ones right now in this era are the police, the courts, the prisons, the military, the government as a whole. So I guess the IRS is part of the government.
Right.
And then, of course, nation states are part of it, because nation states developed as a way of oppressing people. So there's a whole long history and part of that in there too. I don't know so much about schools.
Well, they're
Schools,
part of-
some of them go into the apparatus that, you know, basically teaches people how to be compliant
Right.
with bourgeois rule.
Propaganda.
But, and the reality is they're really talking about the government apparatuses that are used to hold in place the exploitation of one class by another. So it's a lot of fancy words. But, you know, why do we even need a state? I mean, in prehistory times, was there a state, Stephen?
No, there was no,
Like under a communal society
under,
before private property
before
developed?
private property, it was, everything was collectively done, and there was no armed body, there was no courts, there was no forced apparatus of one class controlling another class. It was pretty much done, things were done out of necessity, out of cooperation, but there was no actual body that forced, except the consensus of the whole community.
Rosika?
The Stevens answer, how far long ago was that?
That was thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was,
Yeah,
he's
hunter-gatherer.
referring to the
Yeah.
period, what they would call, it's called primitive communism. We don't use the word primitive anymore, but during that period, what it was referred to. That was before there was class society, before the overthrow of mother right. And that's another whole class in Engels, the family and
Right.
private property. But in that period, there were no police, there were no armies. Julie, you had your hand up.
I was just, to sum the beginning of where we've ended up started with stationary agriculture.
Right. Right.
And so prior to that period, yeah, everything was done for the community, hunt and gather. You take what you need for that time period and then you move in and everybody's in unison, or shunned if they're super bad, stupid. But, so I just thought I'd throw that in.
There wasn't surplus value.
There wasn't,
Right.
there weren't classes, there wasn't any surplus value. There was, you know, the first, what Marx and Engels and others talked about, the very first division in society was between men and women. So it's one of the very first oppressions. So until that existed, until there were actual classes, there was no need to oppress one group over another. But we'll talk more about that. But I think like the big things right now, which have really grown, is police departments. You know, you're not just talking about police departments, you're talking about the CIA, you're talking about Homeland Security, all the spy
ICE.
agencies. ICE is a very big one. I'm surprised people didn't say ICE right away. All of these apparatuses that have like grown, the more that capitalism has decayed, the more monopoly
Parole and
capitalism has
probation.
developed. It's just an extensive industry in of itself. And there's another part where we'll get to this when we talk a little bit more about it more concretely. But it's really all those apparatuses that keep class oppression in place. And we can talk a little bit more about what that means, but that goes into the second question, what is the state based on? Which we've actually been touching on. Anybody want to, Stephen?
Well, the state is based on making sure there's class domination of one class over another class, making sure that society functions for the benefit of whatever class is in power.
Do people agree with Stephen? Somebody want to give an example, or Stephen, you want to give an example?
Well, the police, for sure, that if there's a strike, the people who are on strike can't call the police to lock up the factory owner for violating their rights. But how many times have in history we've seen the police step in and arrest people who are on strike? So that's just one small example. Here in Baltimore, the uprising around Freddie Gray, the police were used to arrest and make sure that people didn't rise up more than they were already doing. They put a curfew in place to enforce people not being in the streets, things of that nature.
Anna, did you want to add anything, or?
I guess just like on a broader level, just like private property.
Private property is a big one. I mean, the origins of the modern police department now, you know, there's debates about this, and I've read a lot about it, and so it's sort of a somewhat of an oversimplification, but it's absolutely true. There's two historical roots to the modern day police departments. One is the slave patrols that were used to catch runaway slaves, and the other, it was the Pinkertons, the people who broke strikes. And I could give another example, a personal example, because in the second part where Sam Marcy talks about the protests that we held against the Klan, if you have ever been to an anti-Klan or an anti-Nazi or anti-fascist demonstration, who do the police have their backs to? It's not to us. It's always, they've got their backs to the fascists and they've got their face to us. Because to them, we are the threat, not the fascist, racist Klan at all. So it's always amazing how they do that. And to a large degree, society is so divided in classes, so rich and poor, so oppressed, that if you think that people would starve, they would go, you know, it wouldn't be true. They would go into the stores and take what they needed from these wealthy major food chains, as opposed to being hungry at night or running out of their food stamps. But they know what will happen if they go in and even they shoplift. They'll end up getting thrown into jail. That's the fear that a lot of people have. And even with the fear, many people are thrown into what's called mass incarceration, which is an entire institution of itself. So a lot of these things have, you know, grown amazingly large, you know, one of them being mass incarceration. So basically, these are words out of the book that say the state is based on the product of irreconcilability, say that for me,
Irreconcilability.
Irreconcilability of class antagonisms. So we kind of explained it, but that's important. In other words, if there were no class differences, we wouldn't necessarily need police to oppress us. We wouldn't need a military to enforce imperialism, to go abroad, fight and kill other people in other poor countries. I can give a bazillion examples, but basically all of these things that people have mentioned above, and it's complicated because Rosika mentioned an important thing which historically people could read more about in terms of what the borders are in the world. I mean, in reality, the working class has no borders. A lot of these borders were formed based on
You can't just
all sorts
cross
of
the
different
border.
reasons historically that have to do with the development of the state during a particular period. But right now we're talking about the modern part of it. So, you know, you have the one major part, imperialist, you know, military armies and all that goes with it. And increasingly, really, not only the police, but really all those other apparatuses like ICE and
Border Patrol.
border patrols, tons and tons of Homeland Security, FBI, all of that, which is just incredible. It's an incredible waste. Now, I wanted to read these two things and people can reflect on it. And it's learning some of this. As much as we have not exhausted it in our discussion, if you get a chance, for those who didn't get a chance to read the book, listen to it, because I think that these concepts are pretty exciting. Because if you understand that, you'll understand why it's important. Stephen, I'm sorry.
I've heard the expression fourth estate in regards to the media, even though it may not be officially like an armed body, but its role in society is to reinforce the state or the structure. So I've heard people, refer to the media as a form of the state, and I don't know if that's a proper Marxist definition, but
It's probably complex.
right.
Because you have two things going on with the media. I mean, obviously, the
Self-product.
schools and all the social institutions that surround all this are utilized to keep the oppressor class in power, and certainly the media fulfills that role. There's also instances in reality that the media is infiltrated by the state in a lot of cases, especially in other countries,
Mhm.
like the media that operates out in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever in the world.
Well, you have Voice
Some
of
of them are
America.
actually part of the CIA.
Voice of America.
Now, part of when they talk about that, they're also probably referring to the fact that the media has become so integrally controlled by the government that they only print one side of it. So, it may be stretching it from the, clear way in which Marx and Engels and Lenin and others talked about the state, but, I could understand why people would say that. And even the question of schools, you've got ROTC, military schools, you've got a lot of stuff like
Well, you got
that.
school police in the schools.
But back on this is an important thing that they say, that has some, now we're going to kind of get into the meat of why it becomes concretely, how can you say it, practical. Not practical like pragmatic like me drinking the soda here, but pragmatic for us in terms of how to strategize and what needs to be done in the revolutionary struggle. One of the things that Lenin said in this book is the state is not separate or above society. And I asked the question, why is this an important concept for revolutionaries? So does anybody want to reflect on that? I mean, if you feel like Stephen?
Well, it means that the state is not some objective, impartial body that just makes sure everyone has an even say. It's actually to enforce. Like the courts, for example, the judge is not impartial, the prosecutor, the whole system is not. Some people think, oh, well, the government, the courts, the police, they are just objective. They don't have a fight in any particular side, which is totally not the case.
Well, that's a very good reason the state is not separate or above society. But it's even a tiny bit deeper than just explaining what they're actually doing. There is a whole concept amongst liberals, so to speak, or what we call bourgeois theoreticians, that the state is forever and ever. It's always something that's going to be in existence. That it is something that's independent of the class struggle. And if you think that it's independent, then you don't necessarily see its role as oppressing one class or the other. So the police are just, in other words, those flowery kind of phony phraseology that they attach to all these things, the veneer, which,
It's not a bad,
is
two bad apples.
halfway true, but okay. You go out, the police department's there to save us all and to help poor kittens that are caught up in trees. Well, if they happen to do that, that's just a side point of it. That's not their primary function in society. But if you believe that somehow a government, a police department, a military, prisons, all this apparatus is somehow operating independently of what is happening to the economic system, then you get deluded into thinking, number one, the state will go on and on forever the way it is. So that's one very important concept, which we already talked about really when we first started this discussion, that during prehistory period, in a more communal period. We don't say that communal period was a good period. I mean, people died of diseases. They probably died by the time they were 30 or 40 years old. But on the other hand, it was better in terms of, you know, there wasn't this kind of class division or oppression. Different kind of oppression. It was really the elements that they had to go through, nature itself. But having said that, there wasn't any military. There was no, you know, major armies. There was nobody, you know. Actually, I think in the book, Lenin states very clearly that any military leader of today's modern capitalist period would, or politician for that matter, or president, Trump or Obama, would greatly wish they had the admiration that any chief person, who could be a woman or a man, could be a person, two-spirited person, had in their very clan or their gens. In other words, in old communal period of time, people won the right to leadership. So people respected their so-called leaders. They weren't appointed, anointed, or so-called elected. Having said that, the other major, most important reason that's important for us to understand when Lenin talked about the state not being above society or separate or independent or neutral is because for revolutionaries, it's an important thing. We need to overthrow the state. So those who believe that you didn't need to overthrow the state, you know, figure you don't have to do nothing with the police departments. You don't have to change them. You don't have to abolish them. You don't have to do anything. You just basically somehow magically change the economic system, and the government and the military all sit out here, and there's no need for, you know, a revolution. So,
can I say
go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, a very interesting case study in that was going on in Venezuela, where the government or through elections there has been changes in representation, but the state was never dismantled. So the institutions that were in the old government, it's still all in place, and it's come to a point now where either there's going to have to be a dismantling and total dismantling of the state, smashing the state, and taking complete ownership of the means of production, and that's what's kind of going on now, where in different parts of Venezuela, the right wing has come back in power, and they have control of the police, and so it's probably another class, but there's a concept called dual control, where both classes have dual power, and so there's conflict, and one class is going to have to take full control over the state versus the other, or really has to smash the state and put a whole nother different state apparatus in place.
Well, I wish Patricia was here, because I remember our first class, people, you know, there was a question about what is the difference between Marxist-Leninists and anarchists. And right now we're going to get into some of this. And we've skipped over a lot of parts of this, but I just want to make sure that, you know, you comrades had sort of just a sort of general sense of this whole point of what the state is. And, you know, people can reread parts of this. But some of the meat of what Lenin is doing in this book is really arguing or having a polemic between two forces. One is what he calls the opportunists, which I guess nowadays you might call them some of the liberals.
Right.
Liberal socialists or whatever. I don't even, you know, call them social democrats. Names have changed. I don't want to put labels on anybody, but some of the ideas, you'll know what I'm talking about when we get into it. And the anarchists. And they both say something totally different. And it's an important concept to kind of get. And you can't get it unless you understand who the state is, and also what Marx meant by talking about the withering away of the state and what that meant. So I kind of going to get into it and then just I could read a couple different sentences and then I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I think reading this is good. He says, in the first place, at the very outset of his argument, Engels says that in seizing state power, the proletariat thereby puts an end to the state as the state. It is not good form to ponder over the meaning of this. Generally, it is either ignored altogether or is considered to be something in the nature of a Hegelian weakness on Engels' part. As a matter of fact, however, these words briefly express the experience of one of the greatest proletarian revolutions, the Paris Commune of 1871, of which we shall speak in greater detail in proper place. As a matter of fact, Engels speaks here of the proletarian revolution, quote, putting an end to the bourgeois state, while the words withering away refer to the remnants of the proletarian state system after the socialist revolution. And later he goes on to say, secondly, the state is a special repressive force. I wanted to read that short paragraph just to, in my own words, kind of contrast these two, and then people should ask questions or even, ponder about how you think what that meant. Lenin was arguing with the opportunist, and it was because he felt that they had misinterpreted Marx and Engels' writing on the state. And that's because, in general, they either didn't believe that the state had to be overthrown, or they thought that even when the working class took over, that the state would go on to exist forever. That some form of armed bodies, prisons, courts, government, police, etc., all the things that we outlined, would go on forever. And so Marx had a big argument against that. I mean, Lenin in this book, I apologize, Lenin. The other argument on the other extreme was the anarchist, who interpreted totally differently, who believed that the state needed to be abolished. And so I'm going to simplify it, but what Lenin's argument was that, and he based it, and many revolutionary Marxist-Leninists have based it on the experience of the Paris Commune, was that there would be a special, more democratic, but when they say proletarian, working class form of repression, that it would exist immediately following a revolution. In other words, that there would be a need for workers' militias, which was what was formed during the Paris Commune, to make sure that the oppressive police, courts, military, the old ruling classes, could not rise up and reassert themselves. I mean, in the Soviet Union in its very early days, there was what they called the White Terror, which was the counter-revolution. And so what Lenin, and I think that genuinely he follows the principles of Marx and Engels, was talking about, was a workers' form of a state. Because a state, based on Marx's definition, is always something that represses something. So under this society, the ruling class, which is a minority class, oppresses most of us. So their state apparatus is used to oppress us. Lenin, all of them, talk very clearly that during the revolutionary period, that there would be workers' militias. I think that's the best terminology. That's what was used during the Paris Commune.
They call it
Once the working class established a socialist society, though, and this is where Lenin differed from the opportunists, that once there was a socialist society, that the state would wither away, because there would be no reason that, because as socialism developed into full communism, which is a system where each according to their need, from each according to their ability to each according to their need, that there would not be a need for police or government as we know it. I mean, it's a lot more to that, or a certain kind of system would be so different that the state would wither away, it would disappear. But as I said, the anarchist, contrary to Lenin, did not want any form of workers' militia, just get rid of it all, no state whatsoever. And most of revolutionary movement contradicts that view. So I know when Pat was asking that question, that's the major difference. not the only difference with some of these groupings, but the major differences around the state, and I'm just going to repeat it, is that the state would wither away, but in that transition period where it's necessary. Now, I'm just going to with this and shut up and ask people to ask questions, because you may be looking at me like I'm crazy. It's not happened that way, and there's reasons why that's never happened, and it's very simple, extremely simple to explain. And I always use Cuba as an example because it's the easiest one, because they're the closest to our borders. All those who've been trying to fight for socialism have not been able to fully develop socialism. But primarily, you've got to realize that Lenin, and there's many statements that I've read where he said this, you know, tons and tons of revolutionaries that I could quote, certainly Marx, all looked towards a revolution. Revolutions taking place around the world, and particularly in Europe, where capitalism is the most advanced. They worried, they always worried that the Soviet revolution would be contained and would be deformed, because unless there's other revolutions, it made it difficult to develop it fully. Now, what does that mean concretely when we look at things, and look at Cuba? They are 90 miles away from the U.S. They still have to maintain, not an oppressive system against their own people, but they have to have a lot of a military presence. They have to be able to think of defense. They have a whole network of people who are supposed to be in the world the best in terms of counterintelligence, that's the right word, you know, to stop, you know, any kind of overthrow of their government in Cuba. So every socialist country, or popularly called socialist countries,
or worker
states, has had to deform its actual development, because they've never been able to get rid of the state. The state is not withered away, because until you really develop a revolutionary socialist society,
it's be a world
the
system.
wither, it has to be, Stephen's right, unless you have a world system, which is what makes our, sad to say, with all of our difficulties, all of our human frailties in this country, all the way in which people have been educated, all of our problems here in the U.S., it's key, because we are the largest, one of the largest imperialist powers in the world. You know, if we got rid of this beast, then the world's people would be free to develop without having to worry about imperialist military machine, which is part of the state apparatus. So I kind of try to explain kind of simply why, if you looked at me after I said all these theoretical things, like I'm not crazy, you know, they haven't developed because of certain historical reasons, and not because Marx, Engels, or Lenin were wrong at all. So anyhow, let me shut up. Stephen, you want to?
Yeah, and I guess if you're say in Vietnam or Cuba, and you're a revolutionary trying to build socialism, and you have a revolution, and capitalism is still the dominant economic system in the world, and it's still trying to overthrow the government, what are you to do? Are you to say, well, throw your hands up in the air and say, well, it's impossible to build socialism, or you try to figure a way to move forward and build a society towards socialism, even though it's not technically purely socialism, but you still have to have control over society by means of a state, and workers should have control, or the most oppressed should have control over that state. So to say that if a country has a revolution, to say that, well, there should no longer be a state, you're pretty much committing suicide, because there's been no country in the world that's had a revolution and been able to not have a state apparatus. Because if that was to happen, the U.S. Imperialism of the West would come in and literally take over everything.
Julie, Hannah, Jessica? Questions? I wrote it out nicer than what I said it. the revolutionary view is, it says smash the state, which means overthrow, overturn, destroy, whatever word you like, because you can use any old word. You know, they all mean about the same thing. The state, which means the police, the armies, etc., etc. And develop a workers' militia, and then under socialism and communism, we don't need a state. The state withers away. I must say, I will say this about Cuba for real. You go to Cuba, you will not see a bunch of cops like you do in the U.S. running around with arms and looking all menacing. It doesn't happen. I'm serious, because I've been there for some period of time. And, you know, nobody walks around and doesn't let you look at stuff. You know, walk the streets of Havana, anywhere. You don't see police like you do here. It's more like they almost perform traffic duties. You just don't. It's just not like that. And
They have
and
committees.
they have defense of the revolutionary committees, meaning all the people in the country are armed or have access to arms.
Organized on a block by
They're
block.
block by block, they're organized to defend their society. So where would you, if a country was really worried about class divisions, they certainly would not do that in Baltimore City. They would not have us armed block by block to defend ourselves. They would definitely not do that. But that's factual, and I met people who work in the committees for the defense of the revolution.
They're average
So-
working people.
It's just, you know, it's just a different kind of thing. And even you can see class divisions, and I'm changing now, but it's an interesting concept if you cross the border into Canada, which is a capitalist country, and it has its divisions, it has its racism against indigenous people in Canada. So it's not a panacea. But I know I went there with a friend of mine who was an oppressed person who was black, and the difference that we both felt as we went across the border, where the cops were not armed at all, you know, we shouldn't see them out there, was just immense. Now, probably because the U.S. has the world's worst contradictions, the largest prison system outside of maybe some dictatorships. I can think of maybe South Africa during the apartheid period might have had more people jailed. I don't know other parts of the world. But the U.S. does have one of the largest imprisoned populations. The contradictions here, the racism, the class differences, the aggravation of racism, and all the other isms that exist here are so intense that you can't go anywhere in almost any community without like feeling like the place is an armed camp. And the only places that I've been where it's been more of an armed camp is like in Colombia, you know, which again was U.S. imperialism's influence. Or you go to some place like Haiti when there was a dictatorship and it was just overthrown, and then you have that same kind of feeling. Or you cross the border in Jordan, or you go someplace in the Middle East and Zionism predominates, and you really see the difference of how oppressive everything is. So I think if anybody has any questions, I don't know if people that are listening remotely want to say anything before we go on to the second part?
I guess
Hannah, go ahead.
it makes me curious about the issue of gun control, just because it's like something that's usually seen as like right wing to like stop
Right.
arms, or I'm just like, yeah, it's something that I've been struggling with myself, and I was wondering if people have like thoughts on
That's a
that.
good question.
Yeah.
We've not had like, we've never actually have a written position that I'm aware of, and I could be wrong. And if I find out differently, I'll come back to the next class. But the party's not developed some kind of actual written part of it. It's not because, I mean, you can obviously understand there's some sensitivity in this question about, you know, I mean, of course here in Maryland it's legal to own a gun if you have a permit. But, you know, there's still legal questions of how we want to promote something. I would look at the question from a class point of view. When they're talking about controlling guns, who are they talking about controlling having them, and why and how? And that, I mean, Stephen used a good example of the Panther Party. But it's on the other hand, I think that Stephen touched on something that's very felt deeply in the community, is that people see, because they have no other thing to grasp a hold of. You see these big tragedies where, you know, these mass murders, where somebody goes into a school, you know, Columbine or what have you, and people just feel so powerless, and they don't know what to say to do. And so the first thing they think is, well, if you have gun control. But the difficult thing is you never see any repression. And Sam, though I don't think we'll have the time to go over Sam's article on Klan yesterday and today, which is really explains the Klan. I was kind of reread it and was shocked at how accurate it was. But it's always a question of, well, what do they do when there's all these right-wingers who have tons and tons of armament? Stephen already put it that, already said this probably better than I did, but they don't ever disarm them. Stephen's going to really talk about just a tiny bit about our history, and Stephen, I'm going to time you, so
Okay.
Just a little bit, sort of what the party has done here.
Okay. Let me just jump right into it, and I apologize because haven't been able to do extensive research and give the full history, and so I'm going mostly off of memory. But having said that, even just off my memory, there's a rich history of Workers' World Party in Baltimore around state violence, going back to even the beginnings of when branch was first formed, which was in 1975, was when Workers' World's actual branch and chapter of Workers' World was formed in Baltimore. And going back to the mid and late 70s, we were, Workers' World Party, were involved in many cases around police terror and police violence, state violence, from a case of a young man called Juwan McGee, who police came up and he was in a wheelchair, and he pulled out a lighter, and they shot and killed him. To Samant Thomas in the early 80s, was at Lexington Market, who had a knife, and they killed, the police killed. We were very much intricately involved in fighting those cases, and from the very beginning, those cases, the number one issue that we've always had in regards to police terror has been around the fact that demanding justice for the victims and exposing the role of the police in state violence. And that means various things. Kind of jumping more to recent history, there's been so many police killings, and I wish Andre and Lee Patterson were here, because and Renee Washington, because I was a young kid and a teenager in a lot of that history, so I don't remember all the names or whatever, but I do remember vividly that seemed like every 3, 4, 5 times a year, we were out protesting or demanding justice on a case. But my history vividly of remembering more specific cases through the 90s and early 2000s is Joey Wilburn, which is Renee Washington's, who was a member from Baltimore but now lives in South Carolina. Her fiance at the time in 2000, who was a mechanic working on cars, and he had a garage, but he had a lot of cars and all the cars couldn't fit in his garage. So what he would do was park the cars outside of the garage and lock them up at night. And because he was a mechanic, his clothes were greasy, as anyone know what a mechanic would look like. So someone saw a gentleman going in and out of cars, called the police and says somebody's breaking into cars. The police arrive on the scene and immediately, make a long story short, they brutally beat him to death to the point where they assumed that he was a homeless man breaking into cars, dropped him off at Central Booking. He was so beaten up so bad that that Central Booking, or at that time it was City Jail, would not even accept him, and told the police they'd have, because they didn't want to be held liable if he died in their custody. That just shows you how brutally bad he was. And so they made the police come back and get him. Well, he immediately died at the police, and we heard about the case. Renee Washington, who, like I said, was his fiance, I think she just put out a small little flyer, you know, to do a vigil, and we heard about it. And we immediately mobilized all our members. We came out to the vigil, and we pretty much met with the family, and they were so appreciative of the fact that somebody, you know, was interested in their loved one's case. And so we sat down and met with the family and asked, you know, how could we help with their case. And through going to different vigils, building a relationship with the family, building trust, that they also trusted our experience and understanding of things or whatever, that we actually formed a committee to specifically to work on Joey Wilborn's case. I forget the actual name of the committee. Worked in coalition with other groups, community, what was Bill Gooden, and Unity in Action, which was a black organization in Baltimore that we had a very strong working relationship with. Let me also go back or whatever. In the cases in the 70s and the 80s, Welfare Rights was a very strong organization. I remember us working and having a very strong relationship and cooperative relationship with Baltimore Welfare Rights, Bob Cheeks, and actually working with them on police brutality. So we've always had a working relationship and tried to build unity and coalitions with other groups in Baltimore around these cases. In Joey Wilborn's case or whatever, it was the demand that the police be held accountable, that they be jailed and charged with murder. That was the #1 demand. Helping to find lawyers, making sure certain things were done, and actually it went to trial. The police were let off, and there was a civil case, and because Billy Murphy was the lawyer at the time, he filed the paper wrong, incorrectly, or not on time, and family was rewarded a lot of money, but the judge overturned and said they didn't file their papers in time. So it was a travesty in justice. But through that, Renee became active in the struggle, became an advocate for other victims of police brutality, and from that or whatever really built a strong coalition with Unity for Action, and really was sort of the centerpiece of all the police brutality cases in the 90s and early 2000s. It wasn't just police brutality cases. There was a case of a man called James Smoot who was brought to Central Booking He had a heroin addiction, and he was on methadone, and I guess he was going through withdrawals, and he basically was asking for medical assistance in the jail. About 10 to 15 prison guards rushed into the cell, brutally beat him to death, and so we worked with the Smoot family. We held rallies, protests outside of central booking, and you know, I strongly believe, even from that in the mid-2000s, that some of the reforms that have taken place around central booking was a result of that. Not just that alone, but other things kind of pushing forward more current, recent events. The case of Anthony Anderson, where, if you don't mind, just 2 more minutes and then I'll wrap up. Anthony Anderson, who was a black man in his late 30s, was walking with his granddaughter through East Baltimore. Police, which is called the Jump Out Squad or whatever, undercover police, saw him walking across the field to go to his mother's house. They literally jump out of the car, pick him up, slam him on his head, and basically he basically choked or whatever, and this was the coroner rose or whatever. They tried to basically discredit and say that he died because he was on drugs. They first said he choked on drugs, but then when a medical examination and medical examiner's report revealed he had no drugs in the system, there was no drugs, this was a total cover-up. We did press conferences. C.D. Witherspoon was very much involved and active, and we worked with the family, did demonstrations, demanded that the coroner's report be released. J. Wendell Gordon is taking the case and actually just settled recently, to Freddie Gray. We were out there every day. You even like look into the city papers. I find it kind of ironic and funny that they did a photojournalist story, and they show all the pictures from all the protests, and you will see Workers' World Party, PPA banners in every one of the protests. Of course, they make sure to cut off our name at the bottom or whatever, so that unless you were there or you recognize our banners, you would know whose banners they are, without giving credit. I just say that or whatever because it's funny how certain groups and institutions will try to diminish those who were involved. And just to kind of give a political wrap up to it in regards to, you know, I said we always demand, you know, justice #1 for the family, jail, killer cops. But depending on the situation, the mood of the movement, where things are politically, our demands have, you know, may have changed. I remember at the beginning of the Freddie Gray, of the Black Lives Matter movement, we were very much, you know, had a demand that there should be community control of the police, which is just a transitional demand or a demand or whatever that doesn't call, you know, for disbanding or disarming or abolishing the police, because at that time that was where the main dominant sentiment amongst the community was, is that there needed to be oversight. The police need to come from the communities, that, you know, people need to, police need to be hired and live in the communities that they police, that there needs to be civilian review boards that are actually have subpoena power, actually are not just rubber stamp bodies of the police, but bodies that are controlled by representatives from the community to have the power to actually fire and jail police. But because things became more radicalized through time, whatever, the demand of disarm the police, to abolish the police, that, you know, we realized that the demand for community control of the police was no longer a cutting edge or a demand that the community or, you know, the most advanced elements were demanding, and that actually abolish the police. That is where the most militant, you know, conscious elements in the movement against state repression and violence were demanding. And so we were very much in solidarity with that movement, and so we added the slogan and changed it from community control to disarm, disband, and abolish the police. But not only the police, the Pentagon, ICE, and those other apparatuses that are armed and repress people. I just say that or whatever because depending on where things are at, where the level of the struggle is, that demands may change. But actually, the ultimate goal is we want to disband the police, we want to abolish the police, and get rid of the police. Thank you.
Any comments on Stephen's report? Okay, then we'll go on to, we're not going to actually go on to, and I have to apologize because I basically said the wrong name for the pamphlet that Sam wrote. I kept reading the Klan yesterday and today. It's really the Klan and government, foes or allies. And this pamphlet, which I sent the link to, people should read it when you get a chance. Because the main premise of it is there's two things, at least when I was reading, a lot more than two things, but the two major parts to it that I thought were connected to this class was how the state apparatus, meaning the police and the other military, are very much, and the government itself, intertwined with groups like the Klan and fascist paramilitary, sometimes illegal groups, and how they serve each other. So it talks about that, but then it gets into some very, you know, interesting and big discussion that's, you know, as much current today as it was then, and that is on the whole civil liberties argument. Because when we called for a major demonstration against the Klan in Washington, D.C., when they went to march in Washington, this is decades ago actually, and there was a rebellion against the Klan. The All People's Congress, which was one of the groups that Workers' World Party launched, or helped to launch, actually called a counter demonstration against the Klan, and the whole community came out, and there really was a rebellion against the Klan. And so there was a big cry, a howl against the demonstrators, and said that we were suppressing the civil liberties of the Klan and their right to protest. And amongst them, unfortunately, was some socialist organizations. But Sam really writes very eloquently, and he also goes into some facts that I don't even recall reading, and rereading this thing, it was very interesting, because the ACLU has always made that argument that they support both sides, you know, in terms of civil liberties. They will defend the Klan's right to demonstrate. So Sam very really, you know, he lays out the argument against that, but he also talks about how, okay, they can cower to the bourgeois state and the ruling class when it comes to defending fascist groups and talk about the civil rights. But the ACLU, on the other hand, cowered when it came to actually revolutionaries' rights. And he writes this thing that it's factual, and he goes into it, and I yellowed it because it's a good fact. He said that the splendid defender of civil liberties, the ACLU, capitulated to the witch hunters during that 1939-1940 nightmare. And all of you weren't alive during that period, but that was the famous McCarthy period. Its national board expelled from board membership Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was an outstanding leader of the Communist Party. And then he goes on to talk about a couple other facts, how the Socialist Party, that also talks about civil liberties, was guilty of purging people and purging communists in the ACLU. So the civil liberties didn't extend during that period, and the ACLU has a very infamous history on that. People just don't know about it. And actually, he documents some of that in some of this history. So if you get a chance, read this, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. But I did want to end with saying to people that, you know, we're about a third through the candidates classes. And that's, you know, just so that y'all can know, you know, we're seeing the light of day in terms of stuff we've been studying. And I just wanted to outline that we have about 6 more classes, and just let people know what they are. And we'll be in touch afterwards about good dates.